Welcome everybody to this, the first Indigenous Superannuation Summit. And to get us started this morning, I'd like to introduce to you Tony Garvey, who's a Wurundjeri man, an elder from this local area, to welcome us to country.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. First of all, I'd just like to say Wurundjeri to everyone, which means welcome in Wurundjeri language, so Wurundjeri. Also, I'd just like to welcome all Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here today. The sponsors of the event, I'd like to thank them for inviting Wurundjeri here today. It's important that we keep our culture going, as we can look out the window now and see a lot of buildings, and that's far from our culture. But the Wurundjeri Wondoon people are the traditional and custodians of this land. The word Wurundjeri means the grub people. Wurrung is a river white gum tree, and Jerry is the grub which lives in the tree. The Wurundjeri tribe is a part of the Kulin Nation. Kulin means man. In the Kulin Nation there were 5 language groups. The Wufurong to the west, the Coorong, who are the westerly neighbours to the Wufurong, the Tunurong to the northeast, the Bunurong to the southwest, and the Wurrung of the Wurundjeri territory that we stand on here today. The Wurundjeri lies within the inner cities of Melbourne, extend from the mountains of the Great Dividing Range, south to the Yarra River, west to the Werribee River, and east to Mount Baw Baw. The Wurundjeri people have a social totem, Bunjil the eagle. Bunjil represents spiritual powers throughout many parts of Australia. Bunjil taught all the laws about life, behaviour and ceremonies to make sure our culture would continue for all walks of life throughout Australia. Bunjil is referred to as the creator of mankind. Bunjil created great people from the land, that is why we call the land our mother, or the mother of creation. The trees and the birds are also created from the land. Never can the land be taken away. The land will always belong to Aboriginal people, as we are part of the land and the land is part of us. Our story is similar to yours. Yours is by your chosen faith, ours is by the dream time. We both have creators and beliefs, and ours is Bunjil. It is a traditional custom of the Australian Aboriginal communities to be asked and to give permission for people to enter their land. And today you have now joined with me to honour the spirits of my ancestors, past and present, who have nurtured this land for over 40,000 years, and we, as the custodians of the land, offer you a heartily welcome to the land and hope that together as citizens of this beautiful country we can build, develop and unite stronger nations for all people. And finally, I'd just like to close in my Wurrung language, Wurundjeri Wondoon Wurundjeri Balak Yemen Kumbivik, which means you're most welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people, and thank you very much for inviting me here today.
Tony, thank you so much for making us feel so welcome here. We've got a very big day on your land today, where we're hopefully going to be talking about some real solutions to improve the outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in relation to their superannuation. I acknowledge that we meet on the tradition on the land of the Wurundjeri people today, and I pay my respect to you and to the elders of this land, both past and present. I also would like to pay my respects to the elders from other communities who may be here with us today. Thank you very much, Tony, and really lovely of you.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, it's National Reconciliation Week, and the theme this year is It's Time to Change It Up. And that sums up what this event is all about. It's time to stop talking about how to fix superannuation and make it more appropriate for its Indigenous customers. It's really about trying to now find some solutions. So this event is about encouraging you and hopefully promoting some better outcomes and supporting action. I just want to acknowledge that this event is the creation of the Indigenous Superannuation Working Group, and the members of the working group are up there for you. It was established 2 years ago. We have met 11 times in the past 24 months. Our focus initially has been on the release of a discussion paper, which you should all have seen, which was published on the 28th of February of this year. And then, of course, we've been working on developing the inaugural Indigenous Superannuation Summit. I'd like to thank everyone on the working group for their hard work in making today happen. And in recent times, we've had some new members of our working group who weren't involved in the creation of the discussion paper. I'd like to welcome them. First Nations Foundation, our first Indigenous representation on the working group, and they're here today. HESTA, the Milestone Group, and AusFund. I'd also like to thank those of you that are in the room that may have contributed to the feedback on our discussion paper, and that's been circulated to everyone, a summary of that as well. So, as you know, you've been allocated seating for today, and the reason for that is principally for our workshops, so that there is a mix of knowledge and experience at every table, so that not all the superannuation fund people are sitting together, for example, so that hopefully you can learn from each other and really be able to contribute your unique skills and experience and knowledge that you might have. So this is very much an outcomes-focused event, and you'll note on your program that I'll be doing the wrap-up at the end of the day. And what I will be looking for is the development of key priorities for us going forwards, but hopefully some commitment from those of you in the room in relation to the future. We want to create a safe place for this discussion to take place, so hence there'll be no filming at that space. But please, this is an invitation-only event, so if you're here, we really do have expectations of you in terms of your contributions today. So once we have received a good overview from our panellists this morning and from our keynote speaker, Dr. Vanita Godinho, we will have two workshops. The first one will be focused on access to superannuation benefits and insurance, and then the second on better engagement, strategies for the superannuation industry with its Indigenous members and its beneficiaries and other stakeholders. So I'd love for you all to be able to introduce yourself to the group, but as you can see, there are 95 people here today, so that would take most of the day. So I'm going to give you, I guess, an overview of the organisations that are represented in the room. There'll be plenty of opportunity for you to introduce yourselves during our breaks, whether that be our morning or afternoon tea or our lunch, but we also have some networking drinks which I hope you'll all be able to stay for at the end. And in terms of who is representing these organisations, you'll find that you each have a delegate list on your table. So we have representatives from Indigenous organisations, also a number of government agencies in the room. Partnering with government agencies in our work to improve outcomes for Indigenous customers in the superannuation industry is going to be vital, so welcome all of you. There is lots of data that you have that others in the room might want. There's certainly institutional knowledge and we hope you will share information with us throughout the day. We have a number of other organisations with us, so you can see that there's quite a variety of stakeholders that are with us here today. And then, of course, we have superannuation funds represented. So, in fact, we have 24 different superannuation funds in the room with us today. So, can I congratulate you all for your interest in today's summit, and I hope that after today's discussions, you will go back to your organisations and really think about how this impacts on your fund and members within your fund, and then bring that information back to the group. So the superannuation industry here is actually, we've got representatives from industry funds, public sector funds, as well as retail funds, so well done all of you. And then, of course, we've got representation from the industry, superannuation industry bodies. So when the working group was first set up with a lot of encouragement from ASIC's Indigenous Outreach Program, it was the industry bodies that got together and thought this needs to be something that goes across the industry that, that we should be working together on. So I'm pleased to see that all of these organisations are represented in the room today as well. So just a very brief overview of superannuation for those of you that aren't from the superannuation industry, because we're going to be talking more about the Indigenous needs particularly today. So we've now hit the $2 trillion mark in funds under management. That's what APRA told us last week. So that's a significant pool of money. There's 14 million Australians with more than one superannuation account, so that causes a lot of problems, potentially in terms of paying multiple fees, etc. And then, the impact of that, and also having perhaps balances depleted by paying multiple insurance fees as well. There are currently more than 6 million lost accounts in the system, and that totals about $16 billion that's floating around and needs to be reconnected with those members who own that money. And as you can see there, unfortunately, the balances at retirement for Indigenous people is about half of that for non-Indigenous people. So anyway, that's a quick overview of that. So the challenge from the working group to you: please participate and contribute your ideas today and your knowledge to our discussions. I'd also like to challenge you, I guess, if there are things that are being said, whether it be at your table in a working group or by one of our speakers that you know not to be quite correct, or you have better information, use this as an opportunity to share that. I'm very keen for us to be debunking any myths that might exist. I think with the knowledge that we have in the room, there's certainly a scope for that, for us to be learning from each other. And then I guess my last challenge to you is please commit to beyond today. I don't want you to go home and go back to your organisations today and go, you know what, that was a really great day, and that's the end of it. What we're really looking for is a commitment to working on solutions into the future. Anyway, that's enough from me. Time for our experts to have a bit of a talk. So I'd like to invite our panel up to the stage.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Jason Eads, and it is my job to actually chair the panel this morning. But I hope that you won't actually hear too much from me, and you'll hear more from these panellists. Just in terms of what we're trying to set out and do with this panel, is to give you a bit of an overview from varying perspectives. Some of it will be a bit about statistics, some will be sharing insights into the Aboriginal community, and others are about the superannuation industry itself and what some of its sites are. I'm going to ask each of the panel members to talk for about 5 minutes each, and then at the end of that I'll give you the opportunity to actually ask any questions and stuff that you might have, hopefully make the session a bit more interactive rather than being talked at all morning. So I'm not going to go into huge introductions on our panel. I believe that you all have the bios of each of our speakers, but I will introduce them nonetheless. So we have Peter Daniel, who's the Research Manager at the Productivity Commission. We have Trevor Pearce, who's the CEO of First Nations Foundation. We have Lynn Melser, who's the Head of Technical Services, Technology and Operations at QSuper. And we have Glenn Brennan, who is the Head of Indigenous Banking at NAB. I'll leave it at that. So just in terms of order, I'm firstly going to ask Peter to give an overview from a statistical point of view.
Good morning, everyone. I have a couple of slides here. And so what I'm going to talk about today not being especially an expert in superannuation, but the Productivity Commission produces several reports on outcomes and aspects of service delivery for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I'm just going to briefly draw on a few statistics that we put into a report that we put out every 2 or 3 years called Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage Key Indicators. And this is drawing on the last one that came out in November last year. And I guess in talking about the data, yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some positives. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there have been improvements in a range of important indicators, in some economic outcomes, in aspects of education, and some outcomes in health. And so today I'm going to talk about employment, which is a key to accumulating superannuation, and also mentioning education and good health, which are key drivers of good employment outcomes. And so I've got a graph up there in front of you. There are three parts to it. On the left-hand side, that shows employment as a proportion of the population. And the reddish coloured bars are the Indigenous employment, and so you can see that starting from a bit over 20 years ago, there have been improvements. It's eased a bit in the last two data points in the survey, but there have been improvements. Around half of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the working age population are employed. So the improvements there. The second part of the chart there shows the main source of income as employment, and you will see that that has also been increasing over the period of the data there. And essentially that means that the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people relying upon income support payments as their main source of income, that's been declining as employment income has increased. And then in the third panel, median household income on the right-hand side there, once again we see some improvements there. So from 2002, an increase in median household income for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So obviously in that chart, there are some, on average, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aren't doing as well as the non-Indigenous population, but there's certainly improvements happening and room for and plenty of hope for the future. And then looking specifically at Indigenous employment, the number of employed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians is increasing in absolute numbers. So whilst we see, in the previous chart that around half the population were employed, the numbers have also increased as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population has increased. About of those who are employed, about 65% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees are in full-time employment. Now, security and continuity of employment, is an obvious factor in keeping track of superannuation and numbers of funds that people may belong to. Our reports have very little information on that. We do have more detailed information on occupations and industries and public versus private sector employment, but exactly how that might affect superannuation, I guess some of you would be much better experts in that than I would be. And then education is a key driver of good employment outcomes, and we see on the graph there. On the left-hand side, we see an increase in the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people aged 20 to 24 who have a Year 12 certificate or Certificate 2 and above. And also over time on the right-hand side, we see sort of over the broader working age population also increases in the number with a post-secondary qualification Certificate 3 or above. So improvements there. And then at a younger age group in terms of literacy and numeracy, and so there's a lot of different data here, but just as an example, this shows the achievement of Year 5 National Minimum Standard for Reading, and so we see there improvements over time for Aboriginal people, and some changes for non-Indigenous as well. Yeah, so overall, there's not a lot of change across all the different year levels that the national learning outcomes are measured across, years 3, 5, 7 and 9, but there are some improvements in there, and so once again there is scope for things to get better. And just finally, we have a whole lot more information available to you, to the general public on our website. So our Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage report has 49 indicators with all sorts of different data in there. That's available on our website at the address mentioned there. We also have links on Twitter, Facebook. We also put out a report called the Indigenous Expenditure Report about government expenditure on services for Indigenous people, and also the report on government services Indigenous Compendium with detail on use and access of government services for Indigenous people. So on that note, I will stop and hand over to others.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lynn Melser. I'm from QSuper. I'm going to share with you for the next 5 minutes, and please, if I talk too fast, tell me, and if I get too excited, tell me as well, because it's an exciting topic for me. The visit was arranged to Lockhart River, was arranged by ASIC. At this point, I'd like to thank ASIC for the opportunity and also the community for allowing us to visit them. Lockhart River is a coastal Aboriginal community in far north Queensland, about 2,500 kilometres from Brisbane. In fact, it is the northernmost town on the east coast of Australia. There are around 600 to 700 people recorded as living in Lockhart River, and the people are mostly Indigenous Australians. I've got a couple of pictures here to show you how beautiful the area is up at Lockhart River, and also the photo on the other side of the jetty to show you that this is the only way to reach the town between the months of probably December and May each year because of the wet season. So their food is barged in at those times. In economic terms, Lockhart River has unemployment of around 19.6%, nearly three times the national average, but I suspect it actually might be a little bit worse than that. It was one of my interesting first learnings when I was filling out a form for a gentleman up there. He was 58 years old and he wanted to claim his super, which all sounded good. And I asked him, "Do you work?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And I thought, okay. I asked him, "Where does he work?" And he works in the local farm. What he actually does is he works for the dole. But he considers that to be work. So that was the very first thing for me to learn. Ask questions, actually, was the first thing I learnt. I meant to also say life expectancy in the community is actually 20 years less than for white Australians, and they have high rates of chronic disease, mental illness and suicide, particularly among young men. But it is improving. This is a retail store in Lockhart River. It's run by the government. During the months when food has to be barged in, it's an additional 30% in freight cost to the food, and a government report shows that this is one of the most expensive retail stores in Queensland. And just to give you a feel for that, if you can notice there, the Bushell's tea, $4.29 in Brisbane, $8.76 in Lockhart River. Sugar, $2.97 in Brisbane, $4.31 in Lockhart River. Soft drinks, $1.78 in Brisbane, and Lockhart River $5.56. Only a few choices because I had to use my mobile phone to take the photos. I didn't know whether they'd like me to do that or not. But it shows to me that sort of living environment the people are living with every day. The daily challenges. Happily though, as Peter has also indicated, there have been improvements in the last few years in terms of life expectancy and in population growth. Now, why we went to Lockhart River, we were asked to go, we were invited by ASIC. As you know, they have their Indigenous outreach program. One reason was because we're on the Indigenous working group, but other one is because in previous meetings up in the community, they knew they had members from QSuper. This photo was taken outside the Pathways building, and this is where we held our one-on-one interviews with members over the 3 days we were in the community. You'll know Alia Gordon in the middle there. She's over there, she's speaking later today. And Nathan Boyle from ASIC actually took the photograph. So over those 3 days, we met probably 90 people, I think, and we filled in forms for just about every possible thing you can think our industry produces. We were fund agnostic, meaning that we helped members from all other funds. And as a JP, I can tell you that my hand was really tired from certifying documents. Now, what we found in the community were there were problems with identification, or really it was problems with our assumptions. Not everybody does have a driver's licence or a passport. Not everybody actually has access to a good photocopier or a justice of the peace to certify things either. Not everybody has ready access to certificates. For example, I found out that a death certificate is actually generally registered by a funeral director. If you don't have a funeral director, like if you have a cultural funeral, then you don't actually get a death certificate. You've got to register it yourself. I also found out that medical reports that we need aren't that easy to obtain. In Lockhart River, it's a flying doctor. So none of these problems are unsolvable, but they all take time, and they're all a little bit more complicated. Technology. We all seem to assume internet access, and we assume people have iPads, we assume that they have personal computers. Well, that's not the case either. English is not their first language, and the sense of family is different. Their family groups often include extended family, and they include people that they aren't related to. Add to all of this, superannuation, particularly having multiple accounts, as I know we'll hear of many times today, can be confusing, and there's also no ready access to people who can help sort these problems out. So what we did in QSuper, when I came back to work, I probably really should say raise awareness was number one as the first point. Someone once said to me that the most important thing you can do to bring about change is to start the conversation, which is what we sort of did. And we've been talking to lots of people at QSuper, including the QSuper board, the contact centre, our risk and compliance people, our marketing people, just highlighting what we'd had experienced. Staff at all levels started thinking about people, not transactions. We found staff began to consider their internal processes and procedures with the individual in mind and looking at the intention behind policy. KYC, for example, rather than just blanket application. And I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants to know what we sort of did about that at any time. We became very flexible. We didn't break rules, but we became very flexible. Bearing in mind, of course, that KYC is all risk-based. I'm looking at my risk and compliance manager who's just walked in when I say that. Specifically also, we sent a few of our trainers to cultural awareness training called Black Card training, with the intention that when they learned, that what they learned would influence programs they built and delivered, particularly to the contact centre and the processing staff in QSuper. Of course, we also made sure that we completed all the cases we brought back with us, and I'd like to acknowledge the other funds for their work with us, which is SunSuper, AMP and LG Super back home. Now, what we also did to find more long-term solutions, we put together what we call an action learning team, which is a team of our emerging leaders to identify what we could do to support our Indigenous members. We identified that of our membership, we think that around 2% of our members are Indigenous, but we're not really sure. That's one of the problems. And we also believe the majority of them live in remote or very remote communities in Queensland. One of the first things that our team did was to meet with a number of Indigenous members located closer to Brisbane. These members confirmed difficulties with proving identity, with accessing money, particularly on compassionate grounds, where they felt the criteria too restrictive. The need for a broader definition of family and also difficulties associated with remoteness. They also told us that for some people in some communities, just surviving is a higher priority than saving for retirement. Finally, we found out from the meeting that our visitor centres are considered uninviting, as is our written communication and our website. The team has only recently finished its report, and I expect soon to hear about plans for a reconciliation action plan covering both members and QSuper as an employer. This is my last very important slide. It is a painting by one of the people I met during our visit. This artist needed help filling in two forms. One was because she had just started work with her employer and needed to register with the fund, and the other was to claim a benefit. She was nearly 75 years old when we met. In conclusion, people were welcoming and patient. One of the things that struck me was how the people I met kept all their paperwork. They needed help in understanding and navigating our processes, and for us to understand the particular circumstances of this group of members. Thank you.
My name's Glenn Brennan. I'm the Head of Indigenous Finance and Development at NAB. About a year ago, I suppose, my old man retired. He's an Aboriginal bloke, 65. I'm not sure about his age. I reckon he was lying because I thought he was older than that or younger than that. But he retired and he had nothing in super. So no super. So I'm always really conscious of this, right, is that my whole working career, I'll work and pay super and there'll be a nest egg or something. But, for people like me, my old man and that are retiring with no super in Indigenous communities. So, and the other thing is, given what I do for a living, you won't believe this, and I've only had 3 employers in my career. So guess what? I found one on Friday the other day. So I was one of the 6 million lost accounts. It wasn't a huge amount of money. And I think that's also really interesting in the fact that we've got, this issue of superannuation that we're talking about and trying to make sure that Indigenous Australians are able to use it and able to capture it and use it for the benefits that it ends up coming into. This is hard work because it cuts across everything from acute disadvantage right through to senior bankers that work at NAB, right? And I think that's one of the really interesting challenges with this is that if there was a silver bullet, then we'd all would have happily purchased it and let it off, right? But the fact is that there isn't. So look, one of the things that we thought that we were doing, we could do at NAB is, and this comes up all the time, so people come up to me with a range of schemes about everything from I've got this issue with a banking account, or I'd like to solve these large financial issues regarding millions of dollars. And I think that one of the challenges we have, or one of the challenges I have, is that people kept coming up and saying that they want their own Indigenous super fund. And for me, I always wondered what was going on with that. And people said, we reckon we could get together $10 million pretty easy. And I was acutely aware that scale and size does matter with superannuation. So $10 million isn't enough to get set. But I was always really interested in what was actually driving that. I think that's, so people felt that their super funds weren't, as you were sort of saying, weren't providing enough mechanisms where people could actually access their super. That super funds, and this is not just an Indigenous specific issue, were investing in things like, Carlton United Breweries. I don't even know whether you can buy one of those shares anymore, but or investing in things that was sort of at odds with what Indigenous Australia was aspiring to do. So what we've been on a bit of a journey to do is that we've been looking at NAB anyway, is to see whether, what are the financial or what are the superannuation needs of Indigenous Australia. So, and we've engaged the consultants and we're part way through that. And I think what we're finding, a couple of things which is particularly interesting, is that the size of the opportunity for Indigenous organisations, and I'll come back to that in a minute, it is significant. It's not $10 million, but it is worth getting out of bed for. So there is an opportunity. What that actually translates into and the offering that is made as a result of that, I think we're still working our way through. But I think that's of particular interest to the group because, there's 2,500 Indigenous organisations out there across Australia, right? And they all report through to the Office of Registrar of Indigenous Corporations. And those, one of my first things is that we're worried about what people find or how they're going about finding, and we talk a lot about lost super, and I think it's a very important issue that we talk about, but it takes up a lot of the bandwidth about what we're discussing today, and I'd actually like to maybe whether we could actually dial it past that. And for people, I've been quite fortunate in my career, but I had a cousin that was much better at school than I ever was, that would have had multiple jobs, probably unable to find his super. And more importantly than that, I asked him the other day, and we want to make sure that these Indigenous organisations are actually, their default super or the supers that they're using are the good super funds, right? we think that, well, I think, and I'm sure everyone in this room, is that when you unwrap that little prize when you put in the queue in the rack on your working career and you're going to retire, then you want to make sure that it's the best present that you could have got, right? And I think that we need to make sure that, certainly with those 2,500 Indigenous organisations, that they are in the best performing super funds that we can possibly get them. Because the Indigenous Australians that in large part work at the coalface of Indigenous affairs, providing services on everything from health to legal aid to substance abuse issues, are entitled to make sure that their super performs just as well as Glenn Brennan's NAB Superannuation Fund A, which is a very good fund, by the way, so I couldn't be happier. But there's no reason that me, who works in the bank, and my cousin that works, I'm not sure where he is these days, but can't have a super fund that is equally performing. And I'm not just talking about performance, right? I think that the performance is one thing, and we get hung up on this a little bit, but also the bells and whistles that are offered within the super funds, insurance and the ability to be able to transport, insurance if you're moving around jobs. But one of the things I think we need to really look at as today is that what is a good super fund that caters to the needs of the demographics that we heard, with some of the geographic challenges that we also heard, also cutting across the spectrum which makes up Indigenous Australia. It's not just all disadvantaged, right? And what maybe can we do around investing? I think that's the real challenge of what we've got. Happy to be convinced otherwise, of course. But it's one of the interesting parts of the work that we'll do today. At the heart of this, my old man did sort of say on the way out the door, he said, this is too important to lose, right? And he only has about probably 10 things that are too important to lose, right? So he has a few. But at the heart of that, I think he understands is that when he got there, there's nothing in the cupboard, right? And for the next generation, I think a lot of our older people are worried about that the next generation will be the same. And we can't have that, right? What we've seen on the demographics is that we've got Indigenous Australia is sort of almost the opposite to non-Indigenous Australia, right? We're young and there's lots of us that are coming through sort of it almost looks like it's the reverse, right? So our ability to be able to get this right, when we talk about the ability for intergenerational wealth is crucial. So look, we're on a bit of a journey. I'd like to say that I've found the silver bullet and it's all okay, and come over here and you can copy my assignments and we'll all walk out of here. And but it's going to be harder than that. And somewhere in between the mixture of wanting to do the right thing and talking about a lot of the social issues, we also need to bring the business acumen of what is a good superannuation fund that delivers great returns for Indigenous Australians, but also has the bells and whistles required to actually make the super fund really be something to be worth part of, right? So we'll see how we go. I don't have all the answers, but we've got little bits and pieces that we're finding. So I do have a little example, but I thought I'd share with you, right? So a CDP in the Kimberley region, it folds, so it goes under. So, and that's not unusual, right? But there's a whole heap of entitlements, including superannuation entitlements, that are available there. They can't find the people. So what they do is they pack up that money. Now the money, there's 272 people that are owed money out of this organisation, right? So I'm doing this off the top of my head, so don't worry, it'll only be one or two either side, right? 270 odd people owed money. They're owed everything from $11 through to $3,802, everything in between. They can't find them, so they pack up the money and they give it to the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous, ORIC, we call him ORIC. A fantastic guy there by the name Anthony Bevan, he gets it. So he gets the money and he contacts, he said, look, we can't really find people. If we got hold of the Privacy Commissioner, then we could just put these names up, we'll nail this tomorrow. And the Privacy Commissioner said, you can't put the names up. So they only ended up finding 50 of those people. And now, don't worry, the other 220 will make up the 6 million also that have got theirs that are lost. So it's a drop in the ocean. But my point is that sometimes even when we get there, we kick ourselves in the eye, right? When the opportunity was there to win something, and to pay people out what they were entitled to. And I reckon there's some of the low-hanging fruit. And one of the things I say around this room, you know, there's no shortage of aspirational goals that we'll need to solve, but where there's low-hanging fruit, we should grab it, get it off the tree and eat it straight away, right? So that's just one of the examples, but that'll be the bit where I'd ask for today. Maybe we focus our attention. But thank you.
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge country, acknowledge the land of the Kulin Nation and whose land we stand on today, and to pay our respects to elders past and present. My name is Trevor Pearce. I'm a Gamilaroi man from Western New South Wales. My mother's country, is Western New South Wales, Coonabarra and up into Moree. And my father's country is Wiradjuri, which is Nyngan, west of Dubbo, into the flat countries. And like Glenn, I have a similar story of thank you, Brett, of family. One of my prized photos is of my grandfather, who drove cattle. And so one of the very few photos we have of him is sitting on his horse in a paddock. So all his life he drove cattle from up into Queensland down into South Australia. And for him that was about being on country. That was about staying close to country and that dreaming track of his. When he died in that saddle and he left his family nothing. And I think, you know, of my parents, and I asked my mother, who's in her 80s, you know, recently, did you pay super? She said, maybe about, at the very most, 5 years of super. She said, but I don't even know what my tax file number is. So we don't know where that is. And I fast forward to today and I think about, you know, looking through what both my wife and I have in super and what we will leave our kids. And they'll be in a better position. But they've been working since they were 18, or even younger, 17, and they've been paying super since then. So it's a catch-up mode for us as a community. So what are the factors for Indigenous peoples? It's lower levels of education, it's poorer health, it's the onset of ageing illnesses at the age of 45 and 55, as opposed to 65 and 70. Remoteness of location plays a very important aspect for community. Cost and resources, cultural barriers, language barriers, complex product information and low product awareness in the community. We know, and it's quite well documented, that Indigenous people have lower coverage and lower balances on average than the general population. The current superannuation arrangements, administrative requirements do not always mesh well with the circumstances and needs of Indigenous Australians, particularly those in remote communities who have difficulty in communicating with superannuation funds and claiming benefits and claiming lost super. We can't ignore the current circumstances are against a history of dispossession and forced dependency and discrimination. That's very real, and our generation lived that legacy, and some of the values that they have in relation to participation in mainstream society is tainted by that. In 2015, we sent out an email to 70 plus financial counselling network across Australia. There's about 70 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are financial counsellors. And for some of them, up to 70 to 80% of their work is around super and trying to deal with super. So I asked them what were the major issues, and the first issue was identification. Lack of information, limited records kept and documents. Incorrect date of birth. And it's quite common in stolen generation members that their date of birth is the 1st of July, the beginning of the financial year, because that was just a sign. It was just easy to assign them that date. The spelling of names is sometimes incorrect. The J and the T and the Y are in the wrong place. One fellow who was my age from the Pilbara. His mother, when he was born, just got up and walked out of the hospital. She didn't do the births, deaths and marriages stuff. And his name is spelt 3 different ways. So he has to prove, and he wants to sort his super out, he has to prove that I am that person. So birth certificates aren't issued at birth. Traditional marriages are not registered. What most Australians commonly refer to as de facto relationships. In community, they're considered traditional marriages. They don't necessarily want to go down that path. Everyone in community and family know who they are. There's traditional mourning periods when sometimes business cannot be dealt with for up to 12 months when someone passes. So everything is put on hold, and in that time information is lost or paperwork goes missing. People in remote communities don't necessarily have addresses and a house address. A lot of the mail go to private mail bags or post office boxes. Many people believe that their managers are the business owners, and not necessarily, so they see their superannuation as being a savings account. There's a higher turnover in doctors and medical staff, certainly in remote communities. And medical records are incomplete or non-existent. There's obviously the issues of literacy. Most people don't understand the forms they are signing. I believe they're saying, having, as I said, a savings account. Funds are set up incorrectly without life insurance components, and people thought they had those coverages. There's great difficulty in creating a MyGov account, particularly if you don't have access to a computer or internet coverage, for that matter. So there's no email addresses. There's limited employment opportunities. There's disjointed employment, means many different funds, creating multiple fees. And people in remote areas can live up to 50, 100, 200, 300 or even 500 kilometres from a regional, major regional centre. So access to consistent doctors, specialists, or even the birth, deaths and marriages register is inconsistent. As I said, there's lower life expectancy. So I'm just going to give a quick summary now that first and foremost, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people often feel disadvantaged by the superannuation system. This is both due to the nature of the system as a system that is reliant on consistent workforce participation, and the fact that the system amplifies disadvantage, including life expectancy, education levels and literacy. Secondly, that there is a difficulty with superannuation funds in trying to engage with community, and it's good to see that Q Super and other super funds have and people here today have taken that initiative. And it's important that there's an industry-wide effort, thirdly, about addressing these issues. What we know that works, these issues that we deal with around identification and life expectancy and education is nothing new for us as Indigenous people. We've experienced these same sort of difficulties in the health system and the education system. We've been dealing with these issues since the 1970s. And this is just a new round of issues that we're dealing with another industry. So there's great learnings that we can take from those other models. And it's important that we do a cooperative approach to this. Community involvement in addressing these issues from a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach is what works for our community. Good governance and good leadership. And ongoing support from government. And sometimes government always doesn't need to be in the room. Sometimes it's good that we do things by ourselves, that there's self-regulation. Recently, this last week in Canberra, we launched a major policy with the Financial Services Council around native title and trustees companies. And there's no government support around that, and no government involvement around that. There's support for it, but we led that, and that's where we need to take the leadership. We are witnessing in our community a transition from intergenerational poverty and welfare dependency to more active participation in the workforce. Our mob are being employed in mining and banks and hospitals and tourism, courts and law firms and education across the country. We've seen an explosion of Indigenous professional associations for lawyers and accountants and doctors that we didn't see 10 years ago. So this transition needs to translate into wealth creation for individuals and families and communities. And it needs to be economically sustainable, it needs to be socially sustainable, it needs to be, most importantly, culturally sustainable for Indigenous people. Thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking our panellists again. We'll now have a Q&A kind of session. It's interesting whenever we start discussions around the Aboriginal community, it's pretty easy to fall into the trap of talking about the negative demographics of our community. The life expectancy, all these headline indicators that kind of say that the Aboriginal community is in a pretty bad situation. And it's true, they exist, but there's also a reminder that they are changing pretty fast. And whatever we design for today has to meet the needs of the future as well. And that there, as Trevor pointed out towards the end of his talk, there are many positive things starting to occur. And so what we do has to take those things into account. And before we do this Q&A, I just want to give a couple more stats that kind of might help you in terms of that kind of thinking. Most Aboriginal people actually live in urban and regional centres. They live in pretty close proximity to all the services that everybody in this room enjoys every day. But still, we find that it doesn't matter where they live, that the issue of access and how products and services are developed to deliver, or to take account of their needs does not occur. Whenever we think about Aboriginal communities, sometimes when we look at these statistics, we default to thinking about remote communities. Most Aboriginal people actually live on the eastern seaboard, just like you and I. And so the challenge that we have is there is great need in remote Australia, and we can't forget about that. But the overwhelming statistic driver behind these statistics that we hear about is that 70-odd% of the population that live on that eastern seaboard. So all of these things exist for all Aboriginal people. Most Aboriginal people may see super as not being the high priority because so many in the community simply won't reach that retirement age. So it's not an aspiration to actually think about where your future money might go because you're not going to be around to enjoy it. The other thing that concerns me a lot, I guess, about these kinds of conversations is that we do talk a lot about assumptions. And there's very little actual facts that exist around this stuff. So we don't know, for example, exactly how many Aboriginal people have a superannuation account. We don't know whether or not a particular superannuation fund has more Aboriginal people as members than another. So it makes it very hard when we then start to talk about what are the issues that we have to address. We heard from our panel members talking about how we might nuance some of these products to actually meet the needs of these particular client base. If you don't know how many members you have, therefore what's the viability of actually creating a product that meets the needs of that client base, then you're not going to be really interested in that. And so I guess part of the question then, or what we try to do, is we fall to the defaults about accessibility, whether or not people are actually getting access, but it's not just that. That's the baseline kind of conversation. It's much more complex, and we need to make sure that we actually lift up and pull up into examining some of the other issues. So that's part of my challenge for you today, is that as you're thinking about the multitude of issues, that you actually look beyond just the baseline. So having said all that, I'm now going to throw over to you and ask, do you have any questions or insights you want to share with our panellists? And I apologise for this side of the room, because I know that you're going to have some difficulty seeing our panel, but it's where the lectern's located. I'm sorry. Does someone want to start off a question, or should I? Yeah, we have one over here.
I was just interested, Trevor, before you were talking about, you've been talking to industries in cycles about solving Indigenous issues, and that there were lessons from those industries. I'm just wondering if any of those might be relevant to our discussions today. Any guidance from that experience?
Yep. To give an example, I live in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, where people don't associate Aboriginal people living in the eastern suburbs. I live in Templestowe. So everyone assumes that we live in Preston and Fitzroy. In fact, the Aboriginal community has decentralised out of those areas. We'd had ongoing arguments with Eastern Health about having an Aboriginal hospital liaison officer at Box Hill Hospital. And they kept coming back to us with the stat of, well, there's only 5 people that have registered as going through Box Hill Hospital being Aboriginal. For the last 20 years, they hadn't been asking the question at administration, are you of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent? So they had no idea of how many Aboriginal people were going through it. People weren't being asked that question. And our argument to them was, if you build it, they will come. So we had Nelda 2 years ago. She said, I'm amazed. In all the years that I've been going to Maroondah Hospital, no one has ever asked me that question of if I'm of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. So they're starting to collect that data, and not only within the hospital but within GPs. We have doctors that are saying, you know, I've seen this patient for a good 20 years and I didn't know he was Indigenous. But they built the cultural awareness around that. They built the mechanisms within the general practice service as well as the hospital. So Indigenous people did feel comfortable about identifying, and the question was being asked, and the numbers have spiked. And they can clearly see there is a need to have those positions in that area. But before that, they just weren't addressing it at all.
Glenn, do you want to jump in and just talk a bit about what the finance sector's been doing?
Yeah, sure. So I think the finance sector, and I'm not going to say that the finance sector is the ants pants or anything like that, right? But I think it's important that when we first started, the bank said the disadvantage in Indigenous Australia is so acute, we need to do something. Well, it's sort of where it started. And what can we do? We can do traineeships, and we can start to look at providing traineeships and internships. But as it's sort of grown up over the last, I'd say, more or less 7 or 8 years, it went from, well, we don't want to be all traineeship and no job. So, the narrative started to change from, well, this isn't just about Indigenous Australia. This now, we want to be able to recruit good people and talent into the banks, right? So it doesn't necessarily just have to be good for a social cause, but it can have a business outcome, was the bit where I think we've started to progress. And certainly all traineeships, no job. And certainly in NAB at the moment, we're saying we don't want to be all entry-level jobs and no management positions, right? So we're trying to get people to climb. But what we've also seen is that there's now genuine competition out there for talent. And anyone that's sort of tried to get yourself an Indigenous intern lately would see just how hot that competition is, as people are going out of their way, and suddenly this has become less about addressing Indigenous disadvantage, and this become really about what is the good business outcomes that are a result of this, because if you've got this sort of workforce that's reflective of the community, then it starts to open up the opportunities that are in this community. and certainly banking Indigenous Australia is where we're all at on this. Now, whether that's at the big end of town, which is, you know, Rio Tinto needs to dig up some iron ore somewhere, so therefore they need to come up with some type of a royalty arrangement with traditional owner groups, you know, or whether it's about microfinance for people that are sort of on the margins. I think what we're starting to see with the banks now is that it's not just about Indigenous employment anymore, it's about what are the products and services that we can offer or we can actually use, which might be existing products and services, so that we can actually capture the value that comes along with this. And I think this was Jason's point, is that there is a sizable opportunity for Indigenous Australia for super. If we look beyond that, it's just a remote issue, you know, and where, so suddenly it doesn't become so daunting, I think, in that sense. But there's no reason that we can't, and the banking sector, the evolution of what the banking sector has done, and in some respects the mining sector also, has gone away from this is an acute social problem to yes, it is an acute social problem, but here can be the business outcomes, or what we call shared value. If you read your Harvard Business Reviews, it's the latest flash letter. We had Kash Rangan, the Harvard professor, out last week, and so it's still top of mind for me. But how you can move it to where it's good for business and it's good for Indigenous Australia. To Jason's point a little bit, when we're starting to talk about people on the margins in the city, it's hard to tell the difference between someone who's Indigenous and someone who's non-Indigenous if they're excluded. So I think that the learnings that we have in this space can be much broader than just for Indigenous Australia, and we've found some of that with the work we've done. Some of the work we've done in the Indigenous space now wags the dog, for want of a better term, because they've actually started to take it back to embrace for other groups, including government. Our Indigenous Money Mentors, by the way, so we have Indigenous Money Mentors that, you know, they're located all over Australia. We keep recordings, we record their conversations with people. I think Sandra's here somewhere. Over 7,000 people have had that. Superannuation is in the top 5, so it is an issue that people do talk about. And access to super, or where is it, or I can't get my stuff and it's hard to access, seems to be, whether it's in downtown Kununurra or downtown Western Sydney, it seems to be cutting across everywhere.
One thing I want to pick up out of that question, though, I think is some of the other things that have gone or taken place within the finance sector. And Trev, I might get you to draw this out a bit further, particularly around identity and how the finance sector was able to actually work up some stuff around identification papers. There has been actually within that sector, you know, what qualifies as 100 points and the evidence that community organisations are able to provide. So I think that's some of the solutions that might help the superannuation sector.
Yeah, it certainly has been an issue, and Australian Bankers Association is here, I hope, that we've had this issue for community about the 100 points. And, you know, once again, the assumption is everyone has a driver's licence, and a lot of people don't have a driver's licence in community. Doesn't mean that they don't drive, and that's another issue. And that also spills over into justice issues, and that was something that was picked up that we identified certainly in Gippsland here. We had a whole group of young fellas that were being picked up through the justice system, and it just came basically down to that issue of getting access to birth, deaths and marriages just to get a birth certificate to start the process. And sometimes that's difficult, and that's in fairly urban environment. But just going back to the bank situation, so we've worked with community. There's the Tarangera Council in the Northern Territory about using their identification. So they have a community identification card where community pay a very minimal fee of $5 to have it like a photo ID. And that's recognised by, and it's supported by Centrelink, and it's recognised by banks in the Northern Territory for community. But unfortunately, Tarangera wasn't refunded this year, so that program is very much under threat with community. But to address that issue for community, we've looked at the issues of not creating a dual system. You know, if you've got the ability to go to births, deaths and marriages and get your birth certificate and have that identification, you should be able to do that. It was about addressing the issue of the vulnerability of community members, those community members that have poor literacy problems or language is a fourth or fifth, English is a fourth or fifth language, certainly for remote communities. So it's about, you know, working with banks and to put in place a process that address vulnerability for community.
Thanks, Joe. So I was going to summarise that really quickly. So it seems to me there's a couple of key learnings. One is how the industry itself has embraced the Indigenous space. And so I think that's what was being drawn out in terms of people getting actively involved, having Aboriginal employment, so that Aboriginal people see it as a sector that is not actually a barrier to them, because there's people working within it that actually know. In terms of getting down to some specifics then, there has been some initiatives, say in the finance sector in particular, that's driven at the heart of trying to address that identity piece in particular, because that seems to be one of the larger pieces of work. So do we have any other questions from the floor? Yep, over this side.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Erin Kelleher and I'm the Director and Registrar at the Victorian Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages. I'd like to thank the panel this morning for their insights and just to tell you a couple of things and then I'll pose my question. The Registry of Births, Deaths and Marriages started collecting Indigenous status in 1986 on birth records. That means that you are 29 years of age, and that's the oldest that the person will be in terms of their known Indigenous status. We also collect Indigenous status at death, but of course that requires the family to identify the deceased person as Indigenous. The additional comments that I'd like to make in relation to correction of records, the registrars have an obligation to make sure that the registry contains correct information. And so if people's names are incorrectly spelt or they don't have the right dates of birth, go to your registry. It can be corrected, and in fact it is an obligation on the registrar to do that. In Gippsland in 2009, the Victorian Registry undertook quite a comprehensive program in terms of assisting Indigenous people getting birth certificates so that they could get driver's licences, so that they could get jobs, so that they could have superannuation. And it's something that we continue to be committed to today. So we have an Indigenous consultant working with us doing community outreach, and we'd like to have many more, except, as Glenn mentioned, people poach your good Indigenous workers. So hands off our guy at BDM. And now, after all of that story, I'd just like to ask the panel, what's the problem about asking people their Indigenous status when they're being enrolled for superannuation? Why doesn't this happen?
Lynn, do you want to kickstart that off?
Yeah, I'll happily do that. I've been in super for 32 years, pretty much. And I can tell you we went through a stage when we were scared about everything. And it was that stage where we stopped asking people about were they Indigenous, where were they born, all that sort of stuff. So we weren't even... It was one of those, the anti-discrimination, it was sort of went over the top, if you like. And I think that's really where it all came from.
Can I just... Sorry, can I ask a question? Just how much does it cost to get a birth certificate?
$30.20.
$30.20.
And it costs nothing to register the birth.
So nothing to register the birth, but $30 for...
Certificate, which is the proof of the birth.
And do you have concessional rates?
No, but we have a fully funded cost for Indigenous people who are on low income.
So money's not the barrier then?
No barrier now.
Okay. Is that new or... The only reason I asked, someone was complaining to me about it the other day. I will.
No, the program started in October
2013.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have an Indigenous Access Program that supports Indigenous people on low incomes for birth, death and marriage certificates, and the cost of that is fully funded by the Department of Justice.
Yeah. Can I just say that that's come up to me a couple of times? I think $30 seems like it's on the cheap side from what I've heard in other states. It can be...
Yes, we're the best value in Australia.
Yeah, best value. and the worst value, we don't need to know the state, but the worst value is $75, I hear.
And then you can pay another $75 to actually walk away with it on the spot.
Right. Yeah. No, I was just checking. It just seemed to be one of those things that comes up. So can I just say the issue of identity, whether it's superannuation or the banks or getting a driver's licence or whatever it is an issue for everyone, and it seems to be something that comes up all the time. I spoke about our Indigenous money mentors before. The number one issue is that identity. So from 7,000 conversations.
So do you have anything you want to add on the identification and why people don't identify?
No, the question was, why don't you ask the question?
I think there's... Sorry, the reason why I asked Trevor to take that angle is I think there's two parts to that. One is once people do start asking the question, and then whether or not Aboriginal people will actually self-identify. And they go hand in hand, and I think what we've heard so far from QSuper is about, you know, the anti-discrimination kind of angle about why people might not ask the question or why they don't feel that it's appropriate to ask it. I think there's some good learnings to learn from the health sector around this particular one, and that's what I want to try and draw out a bit.
I worked with Aboriginal Hospital Liaison Office in the state of Victoria when I first came to Melbourne in the 80s, late 80s. And one of my jobs was to visit every hospital in Victoria to ask around that issue of, you know, of identification. And it was quite hostile from front of office staff about asking that question. And they said, we're not going to ask that question. I said, well, why aren't you going to ask it? Because we get abused when we ask that. People get offended that I ask them if they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. So there's this inherent racism that went with that, and that was in the 80s, and it still, to a large extent, carries over. Like, people think that there's a two-edged sword of that. There's a fear of being abused, and there's also, why should we ask it? You know, what special treatment do these fellas need? You know, what more do they need? So people weren't asking that question. We also found that people swung the other way. We had people that weren't of Indigenous descent identifying as being Indigenous because of what they're going to do, because we get everything. You know, we're going to have to pay for a damn thing, and so therefore we're going to get a better service. You know, so it swung either way, and it's been a really hard slog to turn the health industry, or certainly the health sector, around on that. And we actually said, built in processes and mechanisms about. Also, and our community were also saying, well, sometimes when I identify, I feel like I get a worse service, because those inherent racism attitudes would come out again through the admin staff and through some of the medical staff. So it's a standoff approach. So we built in posters and other campaigns that would sit in the doctor's surgery or sit in emergency and say, you know, if you're of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent, please let somebody know so we can provide you with a better service. And, you know, the other side of the argument is that, you know, knowing your clientele and knowing your customers is extremely important. And certainly in the health sector, you know, there are not so much lifestyle there, but there's medical conditions that are specific to the Indigenous community, specific to the Asian community, specific to the Italian and Greek community, the Mediterranean communities that provide, you know, by knowing those cultural backgrounds of people, you're able to provide a better service to them. And, you know, it's also about, well, how many times do you need to use an interpreter service for your clientele? That's a good measurement of you know, the diversity and understanding your clientele at the end of the day. But it's been a hard slog, and you know, so the issues has been around people weren't asking those questions because of fear on both sides of the fence.
Does anybody else want to add to that, or move on to the next? More hands going up. I'll go over this side of the room, so I've picked quite a few from here, so over this side.
Probably just a little insight, I guess, from I work for an industry superannuation fund, and the question, why don't we ask? About 60 to 70% of our members are joined as what we call a deemed member. We get an employer-centred contribution return and say, here's $100 for John Smith and here's his address, and that's all we get. So we're not, and I think that goes to about 60% of our membership have never ever filled in a form. And the problem is getting, if it's a problem, it's getting worse because now we have all of the simpler super initiatives where it's mandatory now for employers of a certain size to deal with this electronically. So we're not ever getting the opportunity to ask the question, is why a lot of people, we simply do not know. And I'm embarrassed that we have never thought as a fund to ask that question. We will now, but it's just never been something that, as you said, no one's ever thought of the reason why why we should ask, because I guess there's nothing in it for us. We don't need to know a person's occupation. We don't need to know a lot of things to look after their super.
Take that as a comment rather than getting the panel to respond to that.
Well, I guess I do have a question. I suppose are there any cultural sensitivities to asking that question? Because when I go back to my fund and say we're going to change our form, so apart from a reluctance of, I guess you highlighted non-Indigenous people being offended, are there any cultural sensitivities with Indigenous people being asked?
No, not really. I don't think so. I think it's a good demonstration for our community that, it's like when we fly the flag out of the front of a building. It's one thing to fly it out the front, but can I actually walk in that door and feel culturally safe? Is the issue for community. So by asking that question, it's a demonstration to the community that you are interested. And it's that you want to gather some information about them so you can plan better and provide better responses and services. I think I don't see any cultural sensitivities around that.
So just I once worked for a guy called Charles Perkins, and he said once, we must be the most studied race of people on earth, Glenn. And I think that at the heart of the question is that if you're going to put it on there, and if you're going to ask, and it doesn't matter who you are, whether it's NAB or the super fund, you just better have your story straight about why you're asking. And otherwise, we're just collecting, in the words of my father, we're chopping wood for practice here, right? Because we need to be clear about what we want with the data. So, with this information, we're hoping that we'll be able to find you more easily. You maybe have other bits and pieces. But Jason spoke at the start is that we work a lot on assumptions in this space. And I reckon if we were able to collect that, then suddenly, who's got the one at the moment, or is that the insurance one where they're dialing the bit and they can see the person, they're removing assumptions by asking more questions? Well, they're not computers. I could talk about them at the moment. But I reckon we just need to make sure, as an industry, what we've got our story straight about why we're asking and what will be the differences in we're hoping to provide with this information, we're hoping to provide more products and services or better quality service, which will drill down into bits and pieces. Because it's just that, again, it's a low-hanging fruit, that one, and it's easy to grab, but it's probably a little bit of thought from an industry point of view about what's going to happen with it, that's all.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment, because QSIP is a public sector fund in Queensland for the Queensland public servants. we still don't know either who of our members are Indigenous and who aren't. We get a fair idea because we can locate where they are in Far North Queensland or whatever. One of the things, so, that I suppose I brought back from only 3 days, I have to say, but it was quite reaffirming 3 days, is it to tell our people not to treat people on the phone with any preconceived ideas. It's getting back to the assumptions. Don't make assumptions, ask questions. Don't assume there's a driver's licence just because you think there should be. Don't assume there's a death certificate. Don't assume anything. Talk to the person, no matter where they've come from, and find out what they need to know and answer their specific question. Because I sort of agree, if you ask the question, are you Indigenous, then what are you going to do with the information anyway when you get it?
I think another good point around this one is around so many people these days are asking that question. And I guess at what point are we going to link up data to make it easier on the person that once they disclose, it can permeate through the system? And as an employee these days, whenever you fill out your employment declaration, there's a question on that employment declaration. And I don't get why employers don't use it. You know, it's there. Your staff, as they sign up, have declared whether or not they're Aboriginal. Once they've got it in the system as an employer, then if they have to send default information through to the superannuation fund, what has to be done from a regulation point of view to make changes so that that information can be shared? It would make life a lot easier for that Aboriginal person who probably at some point gets sick of being researched and asked the question. So there are some fundamental, just little bits that could be done quite easily. Was there a question over this side? We've probably got time for another couple of questions before we have to wind up.
No, I was going to make the same point about defaulting.
Yeah, so I'll grab one over this side and I'll come back to you over there. Yeah, mic's on its way. I'm terrible at looking at people.
Oh, thanks very much to all of you. My name is Christian Clark. I'm on the Indigenous Super Working Group. My question was, it's come through that the bottom-up approach is, the right place to start. And Trevor said that. It's been, Gary Banks in the Productivity Commission report has highlighted that as, one of the key ingredients. And we've had a few sort of examples of that, ones with working with ORIC and the Indigenous organisations, ones with the outreach programs that's facilitated by ASIC, and the other one's this sort of corporate model that you start with traineeships, then you go on to jobs, then you go on to further engagement and products and services, and that sort of maturing process within an organisation. My question is, are there any other examples, as we're sort of brainstorming for ideas to engage in this bottom-up approach, that panel members could share, so we can sort of get an idea of what are some of the options that we can start thinking about?
I mentioned just before that, so we've, via a partnership, I've seen him walk in here before, Adam Mooney. Is he around somewhere?
Yeah, there.
Oh, there you go, it's Adam Mooney. We've got a partnership where we partner with community organisations, in particular Good Shepherd Microfinance, who's probably Australia's leading provision of microfinance products. And I think this is the interesting piece, is that sometimes forming partnerships with community organisations. So at the moment we lend to people in Australia, and we'll stop, just bear with me, hand signals, right, but we'll stop lending here. But there's a whole heap of people underneath that still need loans, and they remain at the sort of at the margins, and really their only options are sort of payday lenders. So we could actually put the queue in the rack and say, you know what, well, that's not our problem, and pull the doona up and roll over and go to sleep. Or we can actually say, we want to learn more about this space and partner up with community organisation and learn about what it takes to provide loans to people in this market, with a view that maybe one day we can actually progress this to where we can actually have a new market for the bank, and something that we could extend our lending criteria. And so that's one example. The other thing, so that's the provision of microfinance. The other thing is about, we think that we've got a role to play in making sure people harness the power of money when it comes in. So money comes into the house and goes out of the house. So we've been investing again with community partners about the provision of financial literacy. So making sure that people do training so that they can manage the inflows and outflows of cash. And what is it that we can learn about how people are using money, so that we can actually, when we've got our products and services, can amend them so that they actually have a wider appeal. So what I'm saying is that if you can find partners that can extend beyond your normal reach, with the view that you want to learn something about an area that's at the fringe of your day-to-day business, with a view that maybe one day you might go there, it's worth doing as part of your sort of social responsibility in the first instance, but with the one day hoping to move it to the shared value model that I spoke about before. I think in the first, you can do other things like, we could put money into, I love penguins as much as anyone. Only seen about 2, Jace. I'm from northern New South Wales, so I didn't see penguins until I came to Melbourne. I was amazed how small they were. But if penguins are covered in oil, it's not really the problem that the banks create in Australia is financial exclusion, because we stop lending there. So if to sort of pick an issue that's penguins covered in oil isn't really our knitting. But if you can sort of pick something that's close to what you do for a living, or what you are as part of your organisation's DNA, and drill down further on that, I think that's a much more noble way to go about addressing your social licence in Australia to operate.
No, there was, where did I say? There's one over here, and I think there's one over there after that, and that'll wrap up the session.
Okay, hi. My name is Cara Keys. I'm the National Indigenous Officer for the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Just a comment and then a question for the panel, particularly to the gentleman over here who asked about is there cultural sensitivities around asking. I would encourage you, just through what we've been dealing with our affiliates in the trade union movement, always ask whether people identify as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. If you ask if someone is Indigenous, which seems to be a recurring kind of way that we're using today, what we have found is that anyone who is a First Nations person from their country will identify as Indigenous, whether they're from Australia or not. So our new Australians tend to identify as Indigenous from their place of birth. So I think you just need to be quite careful around that you ask Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander. And the other issue that we've experienced back house is making sure that people who have responsibility for entering the data are doing so. So you can ask the question on the form, but if that's not actually being put into your system to then actually use in the appropriate way, that you've got your story for people who identify, you can have it on there for years and then not understand why you're not collecting the data in the most efficient and effective way, which is actually about education for your operations people. My question for the panel would be this. Where do you see working with employers and or Indigenous organisations? And Glenn, you mentioned before the story about the CDP organisation that 270 odd people just went missing. There's fantastic stuff going on around individual education with regards to super, but can we think about, or I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we do employer and or organisational education around their superannuation obligations and record keeping around their employees. And further to that, how much impact in your mind do external policies and or regulations, say the closing down of CDEP across the country and the impact of thousands of people losing their job, where's the line for us in terms of, say, this summit or where we go to in the future with the working group? Where is the line in terms of what are those partners and how do we work with them in ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are able to access and continue to be paid the superannuation that they're owed as workers in this country?
So just your first point around Indigenous organisations, right? And so I'm of the opinion, and I'm happy to be yelled at, but that Indigenous organisations around this country at the moment are just simply besieged with the expectations of, this and that, and just getting by, right? So And I think it's one of the things is that we need to be mindful of just creating more expectations on a whole heap of organisations that are already breaking at the seams here, right? However, in saying that, we still can't sort of get away from the fact that looking after your staff and making sure that you're choosing the right super funds is just as much about good governance as it is about keeping accurate notes at your AGSM and making sure your financials. So somewhere in between there, I think we need to actually, that superannuation becomes part of your responsibilities, and we need to drive that into community organisations. But we need to make sure that there's nothing worse than, you know, providing some level of training to people, and, you know, I've had to do this too, where you go in there and you can see whatever you're providing, and, you know, we're talking about superannuation. I know all you people love it, but other people will think that it's boring and don't want to do it, and, you know, it's not a superhero. I love that ad, whoever come up with it. If it was superhero or Superman, we'd all be excited about it, but as soon as you put superannuation on it, everyone's eyes just roll back, right, and go, oh, I thought we were going to have something fun. But we need to still make sure that we push into those spaces, right? And we push in with training that is tangible and relevant, which is less about pushing product and more about pushing good governance and making sure that we're really trying to, under the banner of this is great for your organisation and this is even better for your employees if you get this right. And maybe that, you know, an extension of that, of providing that type of training, might be the bits and pieces under a pilot. But be careful what you get, right? Because then people have a whole heap of expectations about what else that they want. And that's the challenge. The second part of your question was...
like how far do we sort of, I guess, with the working group or this group here, there are government policies, etc., that affect employment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Yeah.
And I guess you were talking about finding partners, excuse me, beyond the normal reach. As an industry or as a group of people who have a keen interest in this area, how far do we think, in your mind, how far, or with anyone on the panel, how far can we sort of push the limits in our scope, you know, outside of the absolute legislation and regulations and the things that were sort of suggested in the discussion paper? Are there broader areas that we could be looking at?
And I think I'll go back to the theme for Reconciliation Week, is to change it up. Just because of government policy, in my mind, I don't think it's good policy, and, you know, no one's more critical of government than me if I don't get my own way with what I want. Quite like a spoiled child sometimes. But I think it's in all of our interest if we can. The regulators are really looking for some level of what can we do to help here, as opposed to, you know, how can we keep this genie in the bottle, right? So I think that should be compelling enough a reason for us to be challenging of whether it's, you know, I think it's silly that they didn't put those 200 odd names up on their website, right? We would have had them by the end of the day, especially when there's money going out into an Indigenous community, right? I guarantee we would have found them by the end of the week. But I reckon we should be challenging around that. And the flip side of that is that I don't think that the government will see that as the industry being petulant or being self-serving or anything like that. I think the government will see, or regulators will see that as, we really want to help too, but let us know what we can do to help. I said I'm critical of government in the past, and I have been, but here's one thing that I don't doubt for one moment, right? That the people that hold down those positions have the genuine interest of Indigenous Australia at heart when they're making their decisions, right? We just got to help them out from time to time with what works.
I'm going to have to draw the panel to a close. We're actually running over time. So can you please join with me in thanking our panel for... the next session that we have for you, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Benita Cadino. I should have checked with pronunciations, I'm terrible. But this session is actually designed to give you a bit more of an insight into the Indigenous community, and particularly from some of the research that Benita has been undertaking with Aboriginal entrepreneurs and Aboriginal community members around financial inclusion. So I'm not going to go into the bio again, so please welcome
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Eva, for inviting me to this session today. I'd really like to talk to you about how research can transform lives. I know I sound like a bit of an academic nerd when I say that, but I'm actually a banker who switched hats to academia about 4 years ago, looking at the problem of financial inclusion, particularly for Indigenous Australians. I'd like to start my session, though, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge all the elders who've contributed to my own study over the last 3.5 years. And my thesis is dedicated to one such elder, Paul Briggs, who's unfortunately not here today, but I would like to acknowledge his guardianship in this particular research that I've undertaken. So I'm talking about research today and how research can transform lives. Any good research starts with a problem. And my problem is what we call a wicked problem. It's the problem of financial exclusion. And some of the panelists this morning were talking about financial exclusion. It's actually defined as the lack of access to safe, affordable, and appropriate financial products and services. Now that sounds like a bit of academic mumbo-jumbo, but what that actually means that in a developing country, someone who doesn't have access to a basic bank account is called unbanked. That person is financially excluded. In a developed country like Australia, and many parts of the US and UK, there are still people who are financially excluded. Typically, they do have a bank account, but they lack access to simple, low-cost, appropriate products. For instance, a small amount of credit to get them through their working payday cycle, as a result of which they have to go to a payday lender because banks won't lend to them. It could be a small amount of insurance, which they can't afford for their home and contents or for their car. It could be a safe place to deposit some savings where they may not have enough as a safety net to last them through the next payday cycle. So many people in Australia as well are financially excluded. And people find it sometimes astonishing that up to 17% of the Australian adult population is financially excluded. We call them the underbanked. So that's 3 million adults who are financially excluded. But if you happen to be Indigenous, you're 2.5 times more likely than the average Australian to be financially excluded, which is quite a disturbing statistic. Research also finds that Indigenous people are more likely to be associated with lower financial capability, which is the ability to make informed decisions about money. Research finds that this kind of exclusion applies irrespective of where people are located. And people were talking about the fact that more and more Indigenous people are now located in regional and urban areas with as much access to financial infrastructure as anybody else. Yet they will still be 2.5 times more likely to be financially excluded. So there's something more than just access to finance at play here. Another fact that's quite disturbing is that the Indigenous community, of course, has been over-researched. But research finds that financial exclusion in particular has been persisting and chronic, yet there's very little explanation of why this is so. So in terms of being researched, money and money management in Indigenous communities has actually been under-researched. Lastly, research points out to a fact which I find very disturbing, which is that cultural obligations, particularly to family and kin, are identified as a barrier to greater inclusion. This last piece of finding actually applies to culturally and linguistically diverse community groups everywhere in the world who are more likely to be financially excluded. So given that I'm from a culturally and linguistically diverse background myself and from a non-English speaking background, I found this disturbing statistics. And I decided to give up my job as a banker in order to study this problem a little bit more. So before I start talking to you about my study, I'd just like to do a little bit of definitions. I won't bore you, but I think it's important to decide how the study can actually contribute to knowledge and policy. So the first area I'd like to talk about is financial capability. It's the ability to make informed decisions about money, but what the research finds is that this is in order to improve your well-being. So research finds that there are 4 factors which determine how well an individual will be able to make capable financial decisions. One is knowledge, which is all about the knowledge of money and money matters. We call that financial literacy. But the second is the ability to apply that knowledge in practice, which is financial skills. It's also important as to what your attitude to money is. And what's even more recent research finding is that one's motivation to engage with money matters as a whole is an important factor of your financial capability. So factors other than knowledge and skills actually influence the way in which people make decisions. These 4 factors together account for financial behavior. And more research shows that one of the determinants of each of these 4 factors is one's core values and beliefs. So financial capability is actually much more about individual personality and psychological factors rather than just about knowledge or building skills. We've talked so much about money. What is money? If you ask me as an economist, as a banker, money is usually defined by its functions. We all know this. Money is a medium of exchange, money is a unit of account, and money is a store of long-term value. What is well-being? There are many frameworks of well-being, but the one that really spoke to me was one that comes from economic development. And this defines well-being as the freedom that individuals have to achieve the goals that they have reason to value. There are 4 paths to achieving well-being. One is all about internal capabilities, so your own abilities. The second is about access to external supports. So in the financial world, that would be access to finance by itself. The third is about having clear goals and aspirations about money. And the fourth is being willing to undertake the agency or the action that's required either individually or collectively as a community to achieve well-being. So these are 4 factors that make up the model of well-being that I selected for my study. So given this fact, what did I do? I mean, the whole theme for today is change it up. And that's exactly what I did 4 years ago when I started this study. I deliberately set out to design a very different study to what has actually happened in Indigenous issues, particularly with money and money management. So instead of using the lens of economics, I used the lens of sociology. Sociology treats money as a social phenomenon, and it looks at how people feel about money. So it looks at feelings and attitudes, which I thought was more important here than economics. I also decided not to study the Indigenous community from outside in, but to start from a bottom-up approach which looked at Indigenous worldviews on money, financial capability, and well-being. I also found it very disturbing that culture was being seen as a barrier to inclusion. So I very deliberately designed a study that was strengths-based, which looked at how culture can be an enabler rather than a barrier to greater inclusion. I defined culture as the shared values, norms, tradition, and beliefs that Indigenous people hold as a community group, no matter where they live. I defined capability as the ability of Indigenous people to make informed decisions about money, and I defined well-being as the freedom that Indigenous people have to achieve the financial goals that they have reason to value. So that's how I designed my sociological study. It was obviously a qualitative study, and I won't bore you with the Indigenous research paradigm, but it is one that privileges Indigenous ways of learning and knowing. 133 people were included in my study, and they came from remote, regional, and urban Indigenous communities, just because remote areas tend to be researched a bit more. So I made it quite a point to study regional and urban areas as well. I used methods which privilege Indigenous ways of knowing. So a lot of my research was about storytelling and about using art to talk about a difficult topic like money in everyday lives. So what did I find? At the end of my 4 years of study, I've created a sociology of what money means to my Indigenous participants by comparing and contrasting my findings with the literature on Anglo-Celtic, which is the Western understandings of money, which the banking system in Australia is based on. I found 4 characteristics which make Indigenous money culturally distinctive from Western understandings of money. And it's my hope that these will appeal to you as I go through them one by one. The first factor that I looked at was the domestic boundary within which money flows in households. In Anglo-Celtic households, this has been found to be the nuclear family of the couple with the dependent children. But in Indigenous households, I actually found that this domestic boundary was much larger. It included extended family and kin. And it was not just larger, it was also more fluid, because people move in and out of homes, households, and communities very regularly. So the financial unit that we were talking about is not the nuclear family household as it is in Western parts of Australian households. It's actually a cluster of related family households. The second factor that I looked at was one that no matter where I talk to participants, they would say to me that money is not their top priority. Caring for their family is. As a result of it, money is one of many resources, including food, shelter, clothing, love, that is constantly being flowed across these related households. My participants themselves say that money is not their top priority. Sharing money with family rather than saving is how they see themselves to be different from non-Indigenous households. The third characteristic that I found of money in Indigenous Australia is a little bit confronting. But no matter where I speak to people, whether it's remote, regional, or urban areas, my participants say that money has been imposed on them from outside their culture. Any talk of money brings about the sad history of colonization, dispossession, marginalization, and being kept out of the money economy. In remote areas, participants talk to me about how money was introduced relatively recently without much education in terms of how money fits into previously non-monetary traditional lifestyles. As a result of this, in remote communities in particular, money is disconnected from a wealth of traditional knowledge which existed for thousands of years before colonization. This knowledge is one of trade and exchange, not just within Australia, but also with international Macassan traders from Indonesia, which was thousands of years before the British ever visited. It's also a very strong understanding of how to manage and preserve valued resources, but unfortunately money hasn't been connected to any of that traditional knowledge because of the way in which it was imposed. In regional and urban areas, my participants talk not just about a disconnect from knowledge, but from a disconnect with a cultural identity vis-a-vis non-Indigenous Australia as a whole. So feelings about money get wrapped up in a wider disconnect that people feel in terms of their place and their fit within non-Indigenous society. The fourth characteristic that I found was that my participants constantly talk about the role of community elders in knowing about money. Now, in households everywhere, people learn about money from their close circle of family and friends. But this reliance on elders in the community who may not be located within the family or the kin is quite unique. Participants constantly point out that the elders are the traditional custodians of knowledge who pass the right knowledge at the right time to the right people. But this is not associated with money because most of our policy efforts are in training the young through the formal education system. This is great, but it leaves the capability gap for elders. Elders are also relied upon to be the trusted role models for how to use money wisely. But again, the fact that we're not deliberately targeting and building the education of elders is missing out on these important opportunities. So these are the four factors that I found which make Indigenous money culturally distinctive from more Western understandings of money. And in many cases, unfortunately, these have combined in a way that leads to a lot of high stress and grief associated with the usage of money. Many people find managing money quite stressful. But in this community, I found a level of stress and grief associated with money because of all the factors that I've talked about, which makes money something that people don't necessarily want to engage with. It's a strong demotivator, and many people choose to avoid managing money and money-related matters as a whole. So, when we're talking about financial products and services, we actually first have to think about how people feel about money before we can talk about engaging them in products. So that's great, that's a sociology. Knowing the sociology of money, how does this now compare to the definition of money that I looked at previously in terms of its functions? What is money? For my participants, money is a medium of relationships, not just a medium of exchange as it is in economics. Caring is the unit of account, not just money. And family is the store of long-term value, not the amount of money that one has managed to accumulate. So that's great, that's sociology. Does that actually influence financial capability? So going back to the definition of what capability is, it is basically the ability to make informed decisions about money so that it improves well-being. We know that there are 4 factors: knowledge, skills, attitudes, and motivations, which together combine to influence financial behavior. And all of these are very strongly influenced by one's core values and beliefs. Well, my study shows that the for the community as a whole, these shared core values and beliefs, which are the determinants of these 4 factors, are strongly associated with culture. Culture influences the way people know about money. It influences people's ability to practice money skills in families and communities. It influences the way people are motivated to engage with money, and it influences attitudes. So culture is a strong determinant of financial behavior. And I'd just like to make it a bit more practical in terms of how exactly does it do that. So if I look at these 4 factors, the first thing that I find is that money must be managed and used in households whilst maintaining relationships. This has led to a very interesting style, which is an informal style of managing money across a cluster of related households, which I've called a very informal chuck-in style, and I can take questions on that later. I also find that there's a gender in the way in which money is managed. Women tend to do the day-to-day management of money in the households, whereas men like to think that they control the larger decisions about money. How is money controlled? Money is controlled whilst fulfilling obligations. This means that although money is individually owned, typically it's put to joint use. There's an influence on gender in terms of discretionary spending or extra money and how that's used. Most women will complain that their extra money goes towards the kids and the family, whereas the men tend to use the extra money for their own personal needs. But again, that hasn't been verified by the literature. This way of thinking about money also results in very distinctive banking patterns. For instance, many people share banking details with family and kin, but this can lead to privacy and security concerns about the money in the bank account, as a result of which there are multiple bank inquiries about the account and the account balance. These can be very high cost if it's done through an ATM in a remote community. There's also a tendency to hide money in multiple accounts or to remove money from an account as soon as it's received. So this kind of way of banking incurs high costs, yet yields very low returns for Indigenous users. I also find that these characteristics influence how people feel about money and their attitudes to money as a whole. My participants feel very strongly positive about money when the financial choices that they make reinforce cultural norms. Yet they feel very negative about money when the financial choices that they have to make clash with cultural norms. One of the things my participants everywhere will constantly say to me is that money is for caring. This also influences a shorter-term orientation because people feel that money is just for survival. The last bit that I looked at was whether or not these characteristics influence knowledge and people's goals and aspirations and how they want to act towards achieving financial well-being. And my answer is yes, it does. I find that many people are confused still today about money. Elders in particular constantly express a desire to know more about money, and in remote communities to connect this knowledge to their own cultural knowledge so that their people can learn how to use money wisely to achieve their own goals whilst retaining their cultural identity. People do not want to become just like white people or use money in ways that makes them feel like a coconut. There's also a strong recognition that the goals about money can well be family and community-oriented goals, not just individual goals, which in a Western household is what we encourage through financial capability and budgeting. So at the end of the day, what I found was a strong desire to know more about money so that people can use it to achieve their own goals whilst retaining their cultural identity. This influences every element of that financial capability network that I talked about. I won't bore you with the details, but it influences how people want to learn, which is internal capabilities. It influences how people want to access external resource, which is all about access. It influences the goals and aspirations that one has about money, which are more family and community-related goals. And it influences how individuals and the community as a whole want to take action to increase their well-being. And a lot of this falls back to it being community-led efforts, particularly the role of the elders. So, it sounds great. I've come up with the sociology, I've got the tick in the box, I've got the thesis, but how can this actually help us to promote Indigenous financial inclusion? So for me, it was also important to move just from knowledge and theory to practical applications. And I find that my research has policy implications on both the supply and demand side of the financial inclusion debate. On the demand side, it has direct application for the design of capability programs which are culturally appropriate. This is education and skills building. It also has direct implications for product design, including, of course, superannuation as a financial product. It has application for service delivery, particularly in remote communities where access to banking is quite restricted, as is networks and mentors. It also has applicability for a wider underbanked financial inclusion policy as a whole, which is currently not part of our framework. As an example, the G20 last year had a debate on financial inclusion and decided to come up with financial inclusion action plans. And I believe that this kind of research can inform the definition and development of these kind of plans. But this is still too high level for me. So, these are all motherhood type statements. What does it actually mean in practice? So I really try to push myself to come up with an answer for the answers to what is a culturally appropriate design. Many people use those words. We need to have culturally appropriate design. But what does it actually mean? To me, given the 4 factors that I've found, culturally appropriate design has 3 streams of recommendations. So I hope they won't bore you, but I would like to talk a little bit about each. The first is that any knowledge about money must be connected to traditional knowledge systems. There is a wealth of knowledge there about managing and preserving valued resources, about the rights and obligations that apply to the collective use of valued resources, which we must connect to money. These include individual obligations to have a collective benefit with the use of money. They include allocating, managing, and preserving money. Garnering collective support to meet individual goals, as well as using collective governance and control mechanisms, particularly in remote communities, which are quite strongly held by the elders. The second sector of recommendations actually deals with the vital role of the elders. Elders are a vital part of learning about money, although most of our education programs are targeting the young. The elders are the custodians of knowledge. They can also be very valuable role models and mentors. Given that we have a financial counseling network which is struggling with managing expectations and the problems in local communities, using elders as an ally there, I think, is a vital resource that we can build. So if we can focus on building the elders' capability alongside that of the young, I think that it'll also encourage young people to practice financial skills in families, which has been found to be a key determinant of financial capability. I think it also feeds directly into the Indigenous way of learning, which is a lot by following the example of the elders and learning by doing. The last series of recommendations, which I think that the financial services industry might find a little bit uncomfortable, but I'll talk about it anyways, is to use the language of caring when we talk about money. When we talk about saving, if we can talk about caring for oneself so that one is better able to care for others, my research shows that that's a more acceptable way of talking about saving, including superannuation. When we talk about managing money, if we can talk about managing well-being of individuals, families, and communities, and the role that money can play in that, I think that's a much more acceptable way of learning how to manage money and why to manage money. When we talk about goal setting, to recognize that the goals that one has about money could well be family and community-related goals, not necessarily individual goals, and giving people time and space and the opportunity to do that. So that's what I believe culturally appropriate design is. But today was all about superannuation. So how can I leave you with some practical steps that you can actually incorporate into the rest of the discussions for the day? So I've come up with a few things that I can consider are directly applicable to the superannuation industry. In the first series of recommendations, which is connecting the two worlds, I think that it's vitally important that we recognize that money is not necessarily a topic that's talked about much in Indigenous households. And I think one of the first things that we need to do is focus on how can we encourage people to talk safely about money within families and communities. This is called financial socialization and has been found to be one of the most critical motivating factors to get people to engage in money matters as a whole, leave alone products. The second, of course, is that everyone finds superannuation very confusing. I find it really confusing as well. So we definitely also need to focus on building the knowledge about superannuation. But I would recommend the way in which we do so uses methods which are much more relevant to people, which is storytelling. I was at a workshop a couple of months ago, and we had tables which came up with stories about why superannuation is important in different parts of Indigenous life. And I think that that's a wonderful way to teach people about superannuation in ways that are relevant to their culture. I would also recommend that rather looking at written words, we try to use audiovisual media, particularly TV and radio, which I have found to be very effective in terms of cueing people's knowledge and awareness about superannuation. Last but not least, I think that the whole concept of managing money wisely can be directly linked to managing payouts wisely. And if we can come up with examples and real-life scenarios of including this in material and content, I think that we can connect this and make the two worlds closer to each other. I also had some recommendations in terms of monies for caring. And I think that there are two parts to this caring story. One is to encourage people to think about superannuation as caring for themselves in retirement and caring for their family when they are no longer there. But I think that there's another part of the story as well, which is about the employer's obligation to care for their Indigenous staff by making sure that they are managing their superannuation well. And that picks up on Glenn's story earlier about the obligations that people have of making sure that they're in the right super funds. I also have some recommendations about using the authority of the elders. Customer identification is a big issue, not just for superannuation, but also in the banking industry. So in the last 10 years or so, the banking industry has been looking at customer identification, and Lena will talk a little bit more about some specifics. But the use of the authority of the elders has been used in identifying customers quite successfully. I've also found many examples where the authority of the elders and their knowledge of culture has been used to simplify processes for banks and credit unions so that people can better understand what they're getting into. I think that elders, if we build their capacity, can also form the role of mentors who can assist in things such as lost super, combined super, understanding fees, and I have seen many elders playing this role in remote communities. And last but not least, I think that the wise authority of the elders can maybe help to make some progress in the disparity in preservation age, which, as we know, because of the life expectancy gap, has been a policy issue that we have not managed to resolve for a very long time. So that, for me, is what I'd like to leave you with. And I hope that at the end of my talk, I've been able to convince you that good research can truly make a difference in people's lives. So I look forward to using the results of my research in workshops with you throughout the day and hope that we can practically make a difference to people so that Indigenous people can confidently use money to achieve their own goals. Thank you.
I want to sit over in the middle a bit and I'll come over and join. Well, thank you, Vanita, for some interesting insights to your research. And I guess it's one of those things, too often we do make decisions on that kind of gut reaction or what we feel we should do. And as the consultant in me always says that we should look for good evidence-based outcomes, and that's what we get paid to do. And I think sometimes trying to draw out what are those key lessons and where you've arrived at in terms of the things that we should be looking at within the superannuation industry is probably very similar to the conversations we had through the panel, maybe expressed in different terms, but certainly similar kinds of things. This is your opportunity now to ask any questions and participate. We have just over 10 minutes before we move into the next session. So, yeah, a question over this side.
Hello, Brendan Hogan from Sun Super. First up, fascinating piece of research, congratulations. My question, it's very relevant to super, is around, you mentioned this notion of money sharing versus money saving.
Mm-hmm.
Any insights you might have into views on short-termism versus long-termism? You know, is super even on the radar, you know, for some of these people?
I think that before we get into financial products, you have to first talk about people's understanding of money as a whole and how money is relevant to their daily lives. So my answer to that would be to first encourage people to think that money is a resource that can actually help them to achieve the goals that they have. And then superannuation is one of the many goals that they might have. But in terms of prioritising money for sharing versus saving, this is something that Indigenous participants bring up all the time. But equally, on the other hand, they talk about saving as caring for oneself. And I think that using that kind of reconceptualizing of saving, instead of being an individual thing, which I think from a Western notion we talk about saving in that manner, if we can start talking about saving as being caring for yourself so that you can care for others, I think we can directly transfer that into talking about superannuation and encouraging people to engage more with that. Does that answer your question?
Vanita, Glenn Brennan, NAB,
Okay.
I'm your biggest fan. I'm interested in the study and then the evolution of government policy at the moment. So Twiggy Forrest runs around Australia, does up the employment review. He comes back and he says what we need is a healthy welfare card where we take all of the money off the people in the communities and we won't worry about teaching them, we'll just put it in the shop and spend it for them. Because the model that you're proposing seems to be the polar opposite of what is essentially being recommended to government, whether they go with it or not, who knows.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So probably my research is not very popular in that case from a policy discussion, because what research actually finds is when you take away people's ability to make decisions about things that they want to achieve, that is actually a negative capability. So it not just prevents people from developing positive capability, it actually develops negative capability so that they disengage even more. So taking away people's choices is actually one of the worst things that you can do if you want to encourage them to engage more with money matters as a whole.
Other questions? Yeah, well, Eva up the back and then we'll do one down the front here.
Thanks for that, Vanita. One of the questions I have, you mentioned that there's not just a sharing of money, but also sharing of bank accounts, sharing of debit cards and PIN numbers. As we're about to head into a discussion about identification and some of the issues around that, I guess there might be some concerns in relation to that when other members of the community, other than the individual whose account it might be, has access to information about somebody else's superannuation, including even their PIN number.
I think that, is there a policy solution that I can give you that will answer all those questions? The answer is no. But I think that it's important when we do brainstorm policy that we do know what's happening out on the field. So what is real is that people do share this information. So that's reality. We can choose to ignore that and come up with policy frameworks that ignore what's happening on the field, or we can start bottom up, recognize what's actually happening in the field, and then think of creative ways in which we can address it. So unfortunately, I don't have a silver bullet solution for you, but I think we should actually start from recognizing what's real and what's really happening.
I suppose my question is half comment, half question. The questions that you asked in your research, and I think it's picking up on Glenn's point, was that much research that's done around Aboriginal communities starts from a certain standpoint or assumption, and I was interested that your starting points were different. You asked different questions to what is usually asked. And I suppose my question is around, given the stuff that's come out of this, is that really, do you see it as a challenge not only for the superannuation industry but for government and policymakers? And I guess as a further thing for the superannuation industry is asking the right questions. Do you think the industry's on the way to asking a different set of questions or understanding this client base differently in order to service them in 10 years from now just as a normal customer service provider relationship?
Okay, so I'll answer that question in a slightly roundabout way. So as you know, I'm a banker. I've worked in the banking industry all my life, and that's all I knew before I was confronted with this very question in terms of the fact, are we actually asking the right questions? When we design financial literacy programs for Indigenous people, are we actually meeting their needs, or are we meeting the needs that we think we know they need? So that was the very reason why I began my study, and I left the banking industry to do that. So I think that kind of gives you an answer in terms of whether or not I thought they were asking the right questions. But to honour the industry, I think that we do the best we can with the information that we have. So the last 4 years I've spent in doing this research just to build an evidence base that gives a voice to the community. And my efforts will now be, the fact that the evidence exists, so how can we then make use of efforts? So I'm not really criticizing anyone or anything. I think that the questions that people ask have to be informed by the evidence that's in front of them. Now that the evidence is available, I think that we will start asking different questions, and I would love to work with the industry and superannuation as well to think of how those questions can be different and how it can actually make a difference. Does that answer your question?
Any more questions? Yeah, last one. Go for it.
I'm just wondering if your research picked up on any differences between the stories around money and whether superannuation is seen more similar to a bank account and therefore transactional, or whether it was perhaps comparable more to, say, a Centrelink service that is a little bit more, say, bureaucratic, perhaps less product focused and more policy focused, and whether you have anything that we could learn from whether we should be thinking more in the bank account space or the sort of policy service space, because super somehow sits in between.
Okay. So my answer to that would be that the research that was done before I started doing my research was a very product-focused research. So we would start with the product and ask questions about that. So I deliberately designed my research to steer completely away from product and ask about the relevance of money in people's lives. So the simple answer to your question is that no, I didn't go into any particular products at all. I only talked about money as part of everyday life. And the stories that we exchanged was how money is used in everyday life. Having said that, obviously putting my banker's hat on, there is an answer to your question as well. And I think that rather than thinking of superannuation as a bank account or as a product, if we can think of superannuation as a service and ask people why they should engage with superannuation rather than how they should engage with superannuation, I think we'll get better results that way. So my big lesson here is that the user wants to use a product because it means something to them. So they don't just want to know the answer to how they can use it better. I think the question that you need to ask before that is why they should use it. So that story about why superannuation can be a resource that can help you to achieve your life goals, I think that's where we should start.
One final question over here.
Hi, I'm Helen. I found that fascinating. I'm really interested in whether, and I think you did mention it in your talk, in whether you found any significant differences between remote, regional and urban engagement with money and the language around it, and particularly the elder engagement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the 4 factors that I picked were picked deliberately so that they rang true in remote, regional and urban communities. So the 4 factors in terms of the reliance on the elders as a valued source of learning about money rang true in regional and urban areas as well. In fact, I had many stories from people who had moved away from their rural community home to a city in order to study or for employment opportunities, who would then talk about going to the local elders for advice on what they should do about their mortgage or how they should take out a loan. And these were not necessarily related to them through their family and kin. Which is why I was quite conscious of choosing 4 characteristics which ring true across all the locations. But having said that, in terms of the understanding, there are obviously contextual differences between regional and urban communities, which are caused by a number of factors, one of which is the lost generations and the stolen generations, and people not having that connection to land, which many people in remote areas are able to find because they're on country. I also found that there was a large degree of intermarriage across cultures, and therefore the cultural view on money is often, it's a very interesting one where there's a tension between how the couple themselves feel about money because one is Indigenous and the other is non-Indigenous. So there are different factors, the level of socialization, which I talked about, which is talking about money in families. I found that was much more likely to happen in urban areas than it was in remote areas. Thinking about money in terms of longer term and orientation and saving for children, in particular for education, happens more in urban areas than it does in remote. But those are contextual differences. So I think that at the gut feel, that what we talked about in terms of culture being shared values, norms, and one's sense of self and your cultural identity community. Those 4 factors rang true irrespective of who I spoke to in which location.
So that's the conclusion of this session. Can I just, a definitional thing, Vanita, and I know that the term elders gets thrown around a bit, and I just want to make sure that people clearly understand being an older person in the community does not make them an elder.
Exactly.
And in fact, you can be a younger person and be held in high respect in your community, and so have that kind of status. So do not walk away from this session thinking that because we're talking about elders, we're just going to run off and talk to the old people, because that's not the same thing. So can you please join me in thanking Vanita?